Welcome to CPD Live. I'm Alicia Callahan, and it's my great pleasure to be facilitating the discussion today with Light Project. Our topic is lighting to make cities safer, and we will be exploring the associated opportunities, challenges, and parameters. Before we start, in the spirit of reconciliation, InDesign Media acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So following today's session, you should be able to establish and evaluate client requirements in lighting urban and public spaces and understand how best to meet these. Analyze a project brief with relation to a client's objectives, budget, and timeframe to decide what is the best solution for the site. Identify how a design response meets the requirement of the location, as well as associated regional, contextual, and environmental issues. Outline how a particular lighting design response incorporates relevant codes, legislation, and industry standards for both urban and regional areas. And use creative and aesthetic judgment to produce a resolved project that takes into account site-appropriate planning, physical composition, and spatial planning. So to give a rundown, for how today's session will work, we will be having a 40-minute discussion followed by 20 minutes of Q&A. So if you have a burning question for our panel or a person in particular, you just need to send your question through the Q&A field at the bottom of your screen. So before we jump into all the questions, I would like to introduce our speakers. So joining us today, we have Rebecca Kadoran from Arup, and she is a lighting designer. We have Tom Curtis, the National Sales Manager from Light Project, and we have Jessica Christensen Franks, the co-founder and CEO of Neighbourlytics. So firstly to you, Tom, could you tell us a bit about Light Project? What does Light Project do and who are your clients?
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. Look, Light Project are a lighting supplier that assists clients and designers with lighting solutions across all market segments. We align ourselves with local and global manufacturing partners and an expert team to allow us and our clients to deliver great project outcomes.
And so considering today's topic, lighting, safety, and the urban environment, can you talk us through some of your projects and why Light Project is really passionate about this topic?
Yeah, look, Light Project's been very fortunate to be involved with a number of projects that pertain to this topic. We've worked on pathways, recently been involved with the level crossing removal projects, and also been excited with the opportunities that have sort of presented themselves to us through urban architecture. And we were lucky enough to have Arup speak to us early 2020 on some recent research that they had been involved in with Monash University. And this was particularly about lighting to make cities safer. So what we found very interesting about the topic is how many people were feeling unsafe, and with population density and architectural density growing, a lot of linkways or boundaries between sites being considered compliant but yet still unsafe, and mostly from a perception point of view. It doesn't mean that spaces were non-compliant, doesn't mean they're actually unsafe, but the perceived safety and feeling of walking through these spaces was something that resonated with not only women and men. And this slide is something that Rebecca shared with us in the previous discussion, where essentially only 32% of people felt safe walking through city areas where they live at night. And we just wanted to create a platform to open a discussion with architects, designers, to basically facilitate a conversation that allows for better lighting solutions and a better way of looking at designing lighting for these particular spaces.
Great, thanks, Tom. So I think that leads into sort of our first discussion question. So I'll put this to Rebecca and Jessica. How can external lighting contribute to safety and the well-being of citizens, especially women in urban areas? Rebecca, do you want to kick this one off?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, thank you for having me today. I'm really excited to be here discussing this topic with Jessica and Tom and how we make our cities safer. So there's a dramatic difference in the way we experience our cities from day to night. A busy, vibrant park or open plaza by day can turn into a deserted, dark and eerie place at night. The most memorable places are experience-driven and evoke emotion through a combination of light, sound, colour and texture. In creating spaces for everyone to enjoy and feel safe, the consideration and design of nighttime experiences is just as important as designing for the daytime. Lighting at night is one of the most important built environment factors to contribute towards the perceptions of safety in the city. We know that people are less likely to frequent areas where they don't feel safe, and this significantly impacts people's mobility habits and feelings of personal amenity, compounding economic and social impacts for communities. Unfortunately, as Tom touched on, experiences of safety across our cities are not equal for all. And here in Australia, where most probably we think it's a pretty safe country, it's staggering that 1 in 2 women don't feel safe to walk home at night. However, lighting can be used to increase the sense of well-being, giving people more choices on how and when they travel around the city, whether it's for study, work, exercising, or socialising, when it's considered holistically with the landscape, the typology, materials, and the communities using the spaces. Making our cities more inclusive and accessible through careful consideration on how we incorporate the lighting into our urban spaces can give people more power and opens up economic opportunities.
Wow, thank you. Jessica, do you have sort of anything to add to that question?
Yeah, well, certainly. So my background is in placemaking and urban design, and I now run Neighbourlytics, which is a data analytics startup looking at how to measure the urban life in neighbourhoods. So we're coming at understanding neighbourhoods now in terms of what is actually happening from a behaviour point of view. And how I'd think about that question is that city makers generally are trying to make good places, of course, and we know that good places are ones that people love and feel connected to. That's the foundational part of thinking about a great place, which means that you need to be including everyone, whether they're young, old, they've got different mobility, and of course gender is part of that too. And over the last particularly 5 years, I'd say, lighting has now become almost the poster child of inclusion. So that is often front and center of safety strategies. And so that is shifting the way users of the city are thinking about where they can and can't go, but has also become an important signal to people that they are welcome to be in a certain place. So a place that is well lit, and not just brightly lit, but creatively lit and emotionally lit, is a welcoming card to people, and in particular women who might carry around, and younger people who might, or people with limited mobility issues, or older people who are more vulnerable in nighttime settings. That feels very welcoming to them, and then becomes part of this wellness and inclusion part of our cities. And so we know, thinking of gender specifically, gender equality is a prerequisite to wellbeing in neighbourhoods, and wellbeing in neighbourhoods therefore leads to the prosperity of the city. You can't have a well, prosperous, functioning urban environment without everybody feeling included and without wellbeing. They all are connected to one another. And an example of that, just very quickly, is around economic participation. So women are less likely to want to take night shifts or shifts that employment in the evening because of the mobility vulnerability they feel coming home at night. And so that directly impacts women's participation in the workforce, albeit anybody else who has any sort of vulnerability or sense of vulnerability in a dark setting. So you can very clearly see that something as simple as infrastructure provision like lighting has this very big knock-on effect into the way people are participating in the lives around them, but also the economy too.
I think I might just add one quick thing to there as well in terms of how lighting contributes to safety. Like, there is a perception of safety and there's a practical element of the safety contribution, right? So when we look at safety from a lighting perspective, a lot of it is about, vertical surface illuminance, which means people being able to see people's faces. This is not only perception, but this is real life. So if you're talking about CCTV footage or crime or any of these things, or areas to hide or wayfinding or points of traffic and people density, a lot of the lighting factors from a, I suppose, compliance perspective are looking at how do we identify who's in the space, how many people in the space, and what's the associated activity with the space. So these are the important differences or similarities, depending on how you look at it, between perceived safety and real safety. There's interesting conversations that I've had with Jessica before about a space may feel unsafe, but it is technically safe. It is secure. It is not harmful, but that doesn't mean it feels any less comfortable to pass through or be within. And it's a balance of making people aware that a space is safe and it's fit for purpose, and any crime or activity will be detected before it occurs. So I just thought I'd throw that in.
Thanks, Tom. So I guess off the back of that, there would be sort of research that kind of can lead into this perception. Rebecca, did you want to talk through some of those findings?
Yeah. So just on that, so Arup have been researching on how to create cities more inclusive and equitable. And since 2018, we've been working with Monash University, XYX Lab, and Plan International to better understand how lighting affects perceptions of spaces, particularly in Melbourne for women and girls. The research was leveraged off the crowdsourced data from a Free to Be campaign that was run by XYX Lab and Plan International. And this was the largest of its kind at the time in Australia, where women and girls were able to, on an app that was running for about 3 months, pin locations around capital cities. So there was Sydney, Melbourne, Delhi, and I think Bangladesh, where they were able to pin spaces where they felt safe and unsafe, and actually put some description there as well as to what it might have been. So when this data was released, there's actually Hoa Yang, who's a lighting designer in our Melbourne team, was keeping an eye on this research. And she reached out to Nikki from XYX Lab to try and understand a little bit better what it was about these spaces that made people feel safe and unsafe. So from there, we were able to get 900 pins in Melbourne that addressed sites of safety and unsafety that called up lighting in particular. And so we went along over, I say Hoa and Chris from our Melbourne team went out in Melbourne over summer, over 2 weeks, to measure all sorts of things. They took over 164 measurements from 26 sites that were classified as being or had been safe. And I think it was 58 sites that were listed as being unsafe, and listed lighting as one of those contributors to it. From there, the measurements that they took were a whole range of things. They looked at both lux levels on the horizontal and vertical, and the uniformity, which is what the Australian standards reference. But then they took it a little bit deeper as well, and they started to look at the ambient luminance, which is the background kind of lighting, how bright the space feels. They looked at color temperature of light, so how warm. So often you think about dining environments or your lounge room, it's a very warm white kind of light, whereas a 7-Eleven or something like that is a very cool, crisp white light. So they measured metrics like that. They also had a look at color rendering, so how well objects look under light, so making sure you can distinguish between a tree and I guess somebody walking towards you in a blue shirt, what different colors you can actually see. They also actually got into components of the actual sites as well. So looking at the landscape, looking at plants and trees that were in the space, looking at reflectances, materials, how wide footpaths were, whether there were clear routes in and out of the spaces, which had never been done before in terms of a holistic kind of approach. And from there, they had 4 key findings that came out of that, and debunked a few assumptions that we'd already had. So we've already touched a little bit on the brighter does not mean safer. And so what we actually measured is that at some point there can be too much light where it starts to feel unsafe. So if you think about often a car park and those sort of places are really, really brightly lit, which tend to be adjacent to a park, which tends to be quite dark. And as soon as you walk into that car park, you're kind of on edge and feel like there might be somebody potentially hiding somewhere to jump out at you. They also found that layering and context within spaces is really, really important. So kind of thinking about like your laneways and things like that, how is the public and the private lighting working together to make that space feel nice? Is there lighting in the doorways, in the exit signs? Are you able to see in and out of those spaces? Another one of the key findings was quality, not quantity, which, again, throwing more lights at the problem doesn't necessarily make it better or fix it. It's really about the quality of fixtures and the quality of the light that you're putting into the space. Like, are you uplighting some of the trees so that you can actually see through the space quite nicely? How is that? Yeah, again, kind of being able to distinguish between a bush and a person walking towards you. And then the last point, the fourth one, was inclusivity and equality. So from the research, we also found that the current nighttime design practices and how we approach designing the nighttime isn't very inclusive and doesn't cover the full spectrum of society at the moment. And so we've kind of been working through those and looking at new approaches on how we actually engage with the community to have more say in what their spaces become at nighttime. That's like a bit of a summary.
I think there's definitely a few things in there that we will get onto shortly, but I'd just also like to give Jessica the opportunity, working in data and analytics. Do you have anything to add in terms of research from your side?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that I could add, and I welcome more questions from the audience too, if there are any around this. And to pick up on what Tom said before, when thinking about safety in cities, this issue of perception versus reality is a very important one. And what is the actual safety risk versus what is the perceived safety risk? And the reality is the perceived safety risk is by and large in Australia, the one that we have to manage the most, because largely our cities are safe. And so it's the perception of limited safety that stops people participating in the urban environment after dark, because they perceive that there's an issue. And unfortunately, the way safety in cities is often measured is through crime statistics. And crime statistics are actually a terrible way to understand it, because crime statistics only tell you how many crimes were reported. And so there are very clear correlations between neighbourhoods that are gentrifying and actually becoming less crime intense, having higher crime stats, because the people in those neighbourhoods or moving into them are more inclined to report a crime, whereas the past generations of people in those neighbourhoods weren't reporting petty crimes that were happening in the neighbourhood. And so they're not actually, crime stats aren't a great way to understand even actual crime levels or safety levels, but certainly not perceptions of safety as well, because people aren't reporting a perceived crime that might happen, of course. So instead, when we're asked by clients to think about safety or how they might use our data to think about safety, what is quite clear to us is that what is actually a real indicator that people are feeling safe in a place is that they are there, right? And so if people are using a place right through the evening, then it is likely that that place it has this perception of safety. And you can see that needle shift quite specifically when we see construction. I'm not allowed to talk about any of the major infrastructure projects that we work on, but there may or may not be major rail projects happening in capital cities across Australia that may or may not be controversial and have very disruptive construction, which is quite common for those kinds of projects. And what we see for those projects is during the construction period, the activity is quite low until the lighting is turned up very well on those projects, and certainly when more creative lighting elements are included in there, so it's much more welcoming as well, we see the activity levels pick up too. And then when the project finishes and everything's open, the activity levels in the evening are picking up. But another piece of research that we did that I think is quite interesting to this conversation is we did an audit of all of the greenfield development communities for one property developer that we work with. So they have communities, over 20 communities right across Australia in all the states and most of the states. And we did an audit of all their communities to look at, it wasn't specifically a safety audit, but safety was one of the questions they had in their mind, but they wanted to understand the livability of those communities and what the data showed about the behaviour of people interacting with them. And we saw something interesting emerge, that in Victoria alone, that there was only activity in the evenings in about 20% of the locations, but only in Victoria. The rest of the communities around Australia had much better evening participation rates and seeing lots of behaviour and activity taking place. So then when we looked further into the places that did have activity, of those 20%, they were the ones that had functional lights, not that had lights, but had functional lights, because there was a difference sometimes about which lights were turned on in the evenings. And what we saw that in those communities, what we realised is when we then looked at data that wasn't from winter, that first data set was winter. So what's happening in Victoria in the early evening in winter? It is dark. People are not going to be using outdoor spaces the way that they might be in Sydney and Brisbane, and certainly the evening commute in Melbourne is dark very, very much earlier in the year than it is in other parts of Australia. And then when we looked at those places in Melbourne, we saw that in other months of the year, through spring and through autumn, people were very clearly showing behaviours of posting photos about sunsets and about evening light. And so what was happening in those communities is when it wasn't dark, they were walking through those neighbourhoods at the 5 to 6 p.m. peak time and posting photos of the sunset and showing that they were interacting with things. And then as soon as those communities got dark, that behaviour went away, and likely people were driving a lot more and not actually participating in the things around them. And that had an impact on the tennis club. It had an impact on the cafe at the train station. It had an impact on all of those other urban life things. And that really largely came down to access to lighting.
Super interesting. So I think something that sort of comes off the back of that then and feeds into an important question is like, what are the guidelines that are set by authorities like the council? Tom, can you?
Yeah, I think there's two main ones that are set by Australian standards and councils, and one of them Rebecca touched on before, which is essentially, it's AS 1158, which refers to pedestrian area lighting. What this is basically a categorization of a particular space or particular location deemed by typically council. So it's not something that the designer or the developer can typically address, and it's something that's gifted by council, and it takes into consideration things like activity, density of pedestrians and cars, the risk of crime, and then also the need to enhance prestige. So that's the need to enhance prestige versus safety versus crime is a little bit of an interesting one. It's hard to say one, council requirement or one location is more prestigious or needs to be more prestigious than another one, but it is one of the key driving factors in the way that a council addresses a particular P category. And what the P category pertains to is essentially lux levels on the horizontal and vertical plane, which is determined by what fixtures, the location of fixtures, and how you light a given space to meet certain criteria. The other one that's critical, and you'll hear a little bit more about it, which is a separate conversation itself, is this dark skies initiative, which it refers to, not only dark skies, but obtrusive light impact on surrounding properties. It's AS 4282, I think. And basically what that is relating to is, if you're going to light an exterior environment, what impact are you going to have on the neighboring properties, spaces, and sky? So sky is about astrological observation, essentially. So if you're shining light up into the space, which is more common in city areas versus regional, then what impact are you going to have on light pollution above, which is going to limit your visibility of skies and night sky? Both of them are super important, and they are the minimum standards. So it's important to note that when balancing compliance with design, that you look into specific authority requirements and even particular, segment requirements. I know Jessica just touched on, MTM and infrastructure areas. There are particular guidelines from specific authorities, councils, even university and little micro city developments where there's things that go beyond Australian, the typical Australian standards. But I think in order to keep this short, it's, minimum standards are based on P category lighting, and then consider the obtrusive light impact on neighbouring properties. And that'll give you a good start in determining what fixtures are appropriate, where you can place fixtures in order to meet, basically the minimum requirements before going on a design principles journey beyond that.
And can you just repeat those exact standards again?
So for P category lighting, it's AS 1158. And then for the control of obtrusive lighting in an outdoor environment, AS 4282.
Great, thanks, Tom. And Rebecca, did you have anything to
add?
I think maybe elaborate on what P category lighting is as well.
Okay. I think just before, P category describes, there's two different types of P categories. One is for pedestrian footpaths, and then the other one is for open public places, so your plazas and your parks and things like that. But I think kind of going on from that, it's really important to understand what the Australian standards measure, because they just look at horizontal and vertical illuminance, which is light kind of at your eyes on a paint, on like a single plane, so light falling onto that surface. Whereas what we found throughout all of the research is that actually you need to take a lot more than just that into account. Like that's just a starting point to make the space actually feel safe. You need to kind of look at the different topography of the ground, the different materials, how those materials are reflecting light. So brightness is measured, is the light that's reflected off a material. So if you have something that's very dark, very like roads tend to be black bitumen, there's very little light that's kind of being reflected off that. Whereas if you have a concrete bench or footpath, there is a bit more light that's kind of being reflected up and kind of up onto faces and up onto vertical elements, which is really important in designing your spaces to make them feel a little bit safer as well. It's those vertical elements and understanding kind of the topography of the land rather than just looking at a standard compliance tick box approach. So we do tend to work a bit with our security team and our acoustic teams and things like that as well to understand the spaces a little bit better. But we've found that it often comes down to a very linear way of designing these spaces, where we're actually looking more now at holistic ways of designing them and bringing more people and more disciplines into the mix earlier on.
Great, thank you. And I think it sort of leads into the next question, which is what design concepts and processes are involved when lighting spaces for safety, and it probably goes a bit beyond the standards, as you guys are saying. So Jessica, do you want to jump in with this one? Otherwise, anyone.
Yeah, I can jump in because I'm going to give the most high level answer. But I think certainly when thinking about safety, if I assert that to understand whether a place is actually functioning in a way that allows users to feel safe, we need to use activity as a proxy to understand whether that's been achieved or not, because you can certainly have a very well lit space that doesn't feel space. There's plenty of public toilets out there that are very well lit but don't necessarily feel welcoming and safe, and there might be really big perception issues about safety there, perhaps only because of the harshness of that light, and it doesn't feel like a welcoming small scale example. Metro Trains Melbourne just popped up as an example. Great example. So I would say that a good way to plan and measure, and how we certainly work with our clients when thinking about safety holistically, is to be tracking that activity. So understand at a baseline before the project starts or before the upgrade happens, what was the activity level there? What was it to start with? So if it's a retrofit of an existing space to improve it from a safety and lighting perspective, what did activity and behaviour look like there to start with? It's partly how many people were there, but what other activities were they doing when they were there? We don't just want to see a pedestrian count of people passing through a space, because plenty of people pass through train stations not because they want to but because they have to, but we want to see more about dwell time and about people participating in the stopping and lingering and either using the facilities that are there, interacting with retail and other mixed use. And then once the project is implemented, you can then directly compare the uplift from the project and say that once the project opens and the infrastructure has been installed, what sort of uplift has been achieved. But what is even more important than that is also tracking this longitudinally, because if you've successfully created a perception that it is a safe place, you are going to see that activity build and build over time. And you're going to see other shifts in that place, like businesses start to open their businesses later because there are more people around, people having other activities, maybe meeting up for runs and jogs and other fitness activities with one another after dark in that location as well. So it's not just that immediate project opening activity, it is also that longitudinal benefit. And longitudinal means at least a year, because as the Melbourne example shows us, you can't just go a few months because you might get stuck in this seasonal effect that isn't the true indication of how that place is going to work.
Rebecca, do you want to add on to that one?
Yeah, I think you touched on some points that we kind of look in our process as well, and it's like trying to make sure that we understand, what's the point of the project, who's using the spaces before and who's intended to use them after, how they're using it, and trying and getting to speak to those people on the ground and starting to understand, because we don't know necessarily what, I guess we don't, like, what are the barriers for those people to using that space at nighttime existingly, and trying to kind of look at understanding, I guess, the projects that are adjacent to it as well. Because while we are focusing on one particular site, and we see this happening a lot with lots of projects, is that the consideration of what happens at the boundary and what's happening at the project next to it isn't considered. And how do you adjust the lighting level so that somebody coming from, say, the metro train station and comes out into a park, how does that feel for that person then moving on to the next space? Is that kind of balanced so that that experience is seamless, but also feels quite safe? Another thing about considering nighttime usage is that so often we approach it at the moment as just a simple on-off approach, but actually there's lots of different activities that need to happen throughout the nighttime. And Jessica mentioned a few of them before. You know, we tend to have shift workers and a large proportion of shift workers that need to be able to get to and from work, whether that's, you know, walking or catching public transport. We also have people who are studying, who need to study both day and nighttime, how they're getting to and from those spaces, picking up kids after school. And we do tend to see that there's, you know, tends to be a little bit more activity in those early hours of evening, and then it starts to die down a little bit before it gets into the shift workers and after hours kind of workers. But those kind of, those shades of night aren't really considered. And so at the moment, as soon as it's sunset, often it's just the lights on, whereas we should start to actually think about those different modes throughout the evening and how we link them together. So we try to do a little bit of work through that. And then again, going back to the community and you know, figuring out how to get them more engaged and kind of going and asking them questions, getting them to come along to some of the night walks. A big component of what we try to do on our projects is get a lot of the design team out to, you know, whether it's a site or whether they're similar kind of project sites, and across disciplines as well. So it's not just the design team, but bringing along the risk and security team, bringing along the stakeholders. We did a night walk recently, and one of the architects kind of mentioned, oh, I'd never considered how this would look at nighttime. I only think about it during the daytime. And we find that happens so often that even though we spend, you know, 50% of 24 hours sometimes is in dark, it's very often not considered. And so the idea of kind of doing nighttime master plans and kind of working through, you know, when those initial master plans are being developed for daytime, we think is a really important part of the process to getting right and to starting from the onset.
Something that has come up a few times already, and is another important question to cover off, is brighter actually safer?
Yeah.
Tom, I don't know, Rebecca, Tom, do you guys want to jump in on this one?
You can start with that one, Rebecca, because I know you're passionate about this one.
Yeah, definitely, that was one of the key findings from the research, the collaborative research that we did, that brighter is definitely not safer. And there was actually a certain point that we measured where lighting actually started to make the space feel even more unsafe. Again, kind of like looking into car parks and spaces like that, which are really super brightly lit. And even Jessica's example before about public toilets, where, you know, the knee-jerk reaction is to put more lights in and it will feel better, but that tends to be considered on its own and in isolation, and not, you know, what's happening around the space, what, you know, what's right adjacent to it. Is that level, or is that ambient light as bright as this ambient light, or does it step down? Those strong contrasts between spaces of when you add too much can actually really make the space feel unsafe and make people avoid it.
I think from my perspective, I think your eye's a wonderful tool, and areas that, you know, you accommodate and you adjust to suit your adjacent environment. And these areas, and Rebecca touched on before, the blurring of slight boundaries and things like that, where you're going from even one color temperature to a different color temperature of light, transition spaces and things like that. You know, you can't solve a problem by simply throwing more light at it. There's a issue with, you know, energy efficiency. You know, just a best practice design solution doesn't mean throwing more light at one area, which is transversely going to affect that another area is in greater darkness. So you've got these high levels of contrast. You've got your eye adjusting to different environments, and then you've got your eye adjusting to color, temperature, and the density of the space that you've just come out of. And I think brighter and safer doesn't go hand in hand at all, and it's about making sure that the contrast and uniformity is there to allow people to transition between spaces comfortably. Is probably my little addition to that conversation.
Yeah, the perception. All right, so the next question is like, what is that process of working with the client to achieve the best lighting outcome for a particular area? And does that process change for different spaces? Rebecca, can you?
Yeah, so I think we've kind of touched a little bit on the processes and things, but I think lighting for our public spaces needs to go beyond the minimum compliance for street level and public lighting. And we've always believed this, but now that we've got the quantitative and qualitative research to back it up, we can kind of push it a little bit further. So for us, our process is one that moves away from just a linear approach and, getting the different disciplines on at one point and kind of ticking them off as you go through the space, but trying to have a more holistic space and work a holistic approach where we work with the clients earlier on, and definitely engaging, as I've mentioned before, with the local community and the people that are using the spaces to actually help drive some of those solutions. We also look at using some of the tools that we've actually developed throughout the research as well. So one of those is a lighting vulnerability assessment. So we like to go out to the site and actually measure the social, physical and atmospheric qualities of the existing site, if there is one, or the adjacent spaces around it, so that we have a better understanding of the base or the nighttime characteristics. And then also our nighttime community engagement workshops. We try to always encourage people to come along with those early on within the process so that we can start to really develop those ideas from the onset.
Jessica, working more on the data side or kind of helping build out those briefs, like what's that process like for you?
Yeah, well, I touched on this before around thinking about the time points at which we're trying to understand the problem, like what's the baseline, what's it like on opening, and then what's the longitudinal impact. But certainly when you're thinking about space to space, like projects being different, there are huge differences. And we think about safety, it's not whether there's no safety or we've achieved it. Safety is on a spectrum. So people might feel safe enough to do some things, but not quite safe enough to do others. So when working on projects, we encourage the groups that we work with to be thinking about what is it that they're trying, what sort of behaviour they want to see in this place, what should be happening after dark in this place. And there's three different types that we would talk about. One is functional activities, so movement. Do you just want to see that people feel safe enough to be there and move through it? Train stations are a perfect example, or anything that's sort of a high traffic area. This sort of functional use is what you want to see, and then that's what you're looking for in the before and after and longitudinal. Is that the behaviour that you're seeing? Even slightly better than that on the safety spectrum is that people are actually utilising the things that are there. So utilisation is the next type. So for example, you might feel safe enough to use a train station after dark, but not quite safe enough to stop and top up your ticket, because you're not really feeling that safety to utilise the things that are there, and also not quite safe enough to stop and go and buy something at the shop. So if you are actually wanting people to feel safe enough to utilise the assets and interact with them, really be thinking about that and using that as your benchmark for what you're trying to achieve. And probably the gold standard of safety is that people are wanting to explore. So they're treating the place the same at night as they might during the day, which means they might want to take another route home. They might be meeting friends there to go do something. They want to stop and look at something new. And when you're looking at that kind of safety, certainly brightness, you don't just turn up the brightness from functional safety and then suddenly people want to explore there. That's when you can use lighting much more as a tool, like creative lighting and other things, to make it feel not just welcoming, but also exciting and diverse, and get a lot of sort of activity and things happening there to encourage people to explore.
So I have one last question, and then we'll be opening it up to Q&A from the audience. So if you've got questions, send them through now. But my final question for our panelists is, what does the future look like as far as systems and products for lighting urban areas? Tom, do you want to start?
Yeah, look, I can touch on that. I think it's also relevant to know that a lot of the technology already exists to achieve a lot of the design principles we're talking about. Like, we're talking about spaces being used differently throughout the course of an evening or even during the course of the year. And there's opportunity there for, lighting systems and smart lighting solutions to basically use technology that not only identifies a date and a time, but identifies an event, people density, and a particular scenario based on the activity that's being done there. And we touched on it before with Rebecca saying, look, a lot of lighting solutions in these spaces are simply on off. There is a call, and it is becoming more common and more seen out in the industry, that there are spaces that are dimming down when places are not being occupied. They are collecting data. They are working with security and CCTV. They are adjusting, their fixtures are being designed with different optical distributions that balance glare with uniformity and even illumination over a distance. And then you're also now given the ability through similar fixture design and things like that to, have one fixture that does multiple or serves multiple purposes. Like you may look at, lighting the wayfinding or the path of travel of the adjacent building. So you've got this level of vision from waypoint to waypoint. And then you're also looking at dimming levels up and down in order to establish hierarchy of, different paths and different movements from train station to bus station to whatever it is. I think smart cities is another term that you'll hear quite a lot. And it's a matter of using luminaires and fixtures to evaluate real life and real-time data. So a lot will come into, I think, over the next few years in this space being, what does the real-time data provide back to that fitting to allow it to adjust itself to suit a particular environment or model? I don't know if you want to add some more to that, Rebecca, and what you found in being on the specification side.
So I think there's a couple of things which is really exciting about how we start to reimagine, I guess, the nighttime environment, is that we, apart from systems, like there is a lot of, I think, technology that's being developed that allows us to do more things cleverly with light fixtures. So instead of just, the standard old wall light that kind of goes onto the wall, there are technical beam angles where we can get better efficiencies and things like that. But also the processes that we use to start thinking about nighttime. So instead of it just being, ticking off a compliance and Australian standards that we need to meet, how do we engage better with the community? How do we engage better with all of the disciplines to be able to come up with better solutions that are site specific? I think that that's really, really exciting about how we reimagine the nighttime, because at the moment, we've seen those stats. It's not just women and girls that don't find some environments safe. There's actually a much more broad range. And so I think we need to reimagine how we do that, and those processes to how we do that, I think, is really exciting how we tackle it.
And I know from our earlier discussions, you also talked about the recyclability and sort of end of life of LEDs as another sort of future element.
Yeah, I think at the moment we have a lot of spaces, like LED technology has been around and being used, I think, for at least 10 years, probably longer in some instances. And it's starting to get to some of the ends of its life at the moment. So that whole idea of how we start to upgrade and start to think about circularity and luminaire circularity into those products and update it is really exciting. I think we're just starting to get there and starting to get people thinking about it. So I think that'll be something new over the next couple of years as well.
Great. Well, we have a lot of questions coming through, so maybe let's try and answer them as quickly as we can, because we do only have a bit over 15 minutes left. So first question, why do some councils not allow tennis courts to be lit at night? And this might be something you know, Beck. Or
different councils have different rules, but often it's come from a security and a risk point where they don't want to light parks at night time because they don't want to attract not wanted behaviour, basically. And so a lot of parklands and a lot of open spaces are not lit at night because of that, and that's just a general rule. I think that there are ways that you can actually incorporate lighting a little bit more subtly that encourages people to make more use of those without encouraging unsociable behaviour as well.
Okay. This is a very Melbourne-specific question, so not sure if anyone will have an answer, but Yarra Council has refused to provide any lighting up an unsafe path near the river in Richmond because it will disturb wildlife. What are your thoughts?
Look, I'll only answer the very little bit I know about that, but that does come into this sort of standard of obtrusive light, and obtrusive light doesn't only, or I suppose the way they're looking at it now, doesn't only pertain to people, it pertains to wildlife, flora and fauna. So there are particular councils, and more so typically in regional areas, so not necessarily along the Yarra, where this idea of your lighting design or the fixtures implemented in a specific space do not impact on the native wildlife and allow them to breed and rest and be comfortable and all that sort of stuff. So I can only think that it might pertain to, that obtrusive light characteristic or standard impacting on particular wildlife that's rare to that area. I don't know, Beck, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, this is definitely an important one, and I know that we've looked at different solutions where we've tried to incorporate sensors and things like that as well, so that you're only picking up human activity as opposed to the nocturnal wildlife. The way that animals, and I think it's really, we're only just starting to scratch the surface on this, but the way that light and animals work is very differently as well. They tend to see more spectrums than we do, and so trying to avoid cooler lights, which have more blue content and more blue wavelengths, is something that you try to do in park areas. But we're, as I said, kind of starting to get there and understanding like the different wavelengths and how they impact and affect wildlife is quite different to how humans are. But I think maybe it's probably, they're not wanting to disturb those nocturnal animals through there.
Which actually, that's another question that has come through is, can you explain color temperature and its relationship to safety?
Okay, so color temperature is measured in kelvins. And so if we think about daylight, daylight is kind of described as 7,500 K of Kelvin. And then if we think on the opposite spectrum of warm white light, so warm white light is something like when you go out to a nice dinner, like you go out to a restaurant, it's that nice warm orange glow that you tend to have. That's a much lower color temperature at 2,500 Kelvin. And then your office environment, so like the place that I'm sitting in at the moment, you typically light them to a neutral white light, which is described as 4,000 K. So when you're talking about white light, you can say it's either a very warm white light, so on the kind of dining experience, kind of neutral white light, which is your office environment, and then daylight, which is more around your 7,500 Kelvin.
I think, look, I'll add one thing there to help answer that question about what does color temperature have to do with safety of a particular environment? And it might even come back more to Jessica's skill set, where we're trying to create spaces that people feel comfortable in. So if you start at a nighttime environment where you've come from a hospitality venue and you're hit by a 4,000 K cool white scenario, it doesn't encourage people to linger or spend time or create population density. So there's this idea of like, how do we create these transition ways or these link ways between certain environments or place or location, respond to, I suppose, the needs of that particular place? Is it a thoroughfare? Is it a place you want people to linger? And how do you respond with the appropriate color temperature to suit that? I don't know, Jessica, have you found any information on what lighting color temperatures may impact on people wanting to stay in place for longer?
Not color temperature specifically, but certainly the feeling whether the lighting is utilitarian lighting or whether it's more a human scale, which perhaps has more creative elements to it and something a bit more interesting to look at, feeling welcoming in that perspective. But so just from being someone walking around the street, certainly I know that the warmer tones are more welcoming than the brighter, harsher ones. And certainly issues of when light cuts off very quickly and you have very well lit, sort of utilitarian lit areas, and then very quickly they become dark, some are much more problematic than neighbourhoods that are just consistently dim.
Yeah, and it's interesting, you may have, I mean, I know we've got a couple of minutes left, but some specific councils do have guidelines around colour temperature. I know the latest report that I read from Melbourne City Council, it does suggest that 4,000 K is going to be the colour temperature utilised throughout most public spaces for pathways and access. And whether that's right or wrong, you probably do need to consult your local council on if they have any preference on that. Beck, is that your experience?
Yeah, look, people are generally drawn towards the warmer colour temperatures of light. Like, I'm kind of reminded to dining and going out to bars and things like that, but it's that flame, it's that warmth kind of colour. And we did find that in the research as well, it's those spaces that have more layering and also more warmer colour temperatures, as opposed to the very cool utilitarian or 7-Eleven kind of style white lighting that people tend to avoid, or they instantly feel unsafe by those kind of types of lighting, and probably because they have been overused. And I think that it's probably been used a lot initially because of the energy efficiency when moving to LED. LED is blue to sort of start with, and so it's when you start to add the phosphor, it's a very cool white light. The more you add to get it to a warmer, the less efficient it becomes. And so I think a lot of the time, like, those efficiencies are being driven by using cooler lights because they are more energy efficient, essentially. But that doesn't mean that people feel nice sitting in, 7,500 K super blue white light.
Something that did come up as you guys were talking is that idea of urban, like city environments versus regional or country areas. How do lighting concepts sort of change as you move from the city out to the country? I don't know if anyone in particular wants to.
I guess so. When you're starting with those lighting concepts, understanding the space and where you're lighting is really important, because there is always an existing lighting level or perceived lighting level. So in the cities, we're generally already starting, because of all the spill light from street lights and from public and private buildings, just starting with a higher level. Whereas when you do move to the country areas, it is a much lower lighting level. But again, kind of looking at the space that you're lighting, the adjacent properties around it, and how you're wanting to move people through and around the site is really important. So making sure that they can see clearly around the corner is important, but you do tend to start to look at different technologies that you might use. Instead of pole top high fixtures spaced every 5 meters, it might be something a little bit softer and lower.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, even depending on how regional you go, you do have other things to consider, like your access to power and existing infrastructure. Most of those regional councils and alike don't have the money or budget to do significant upgrades, although they should. There's a balance between what's realistic and what's available to them from a, basically cost perspective as well, which, it's got to be mindful of.
Yeah, I think what's also not considered sometimes is, depending on the space, if it's quite open, you can actually see a fair bit at night time under the moonlight, or just at night once your eyes adapt. So again, understanding like the spaces and what they're linking and what's kind of between them is really important as well, because you don't necessarily need to chuck heaps of light at spaces just because.
And certainly the other difference between urban and more regional locations, so I live in regional Victoria, you might be able to hear the birds outside, but is that the perception of safety is different. So certain locations like urban main streets in regional areas, perhaps there's a higher perception of safety than there are in the same type of main street in the city. So what you have to do to get people to feel safe there is perhaps less in some instances, and the reverse might be true in other locations, like train stations probably have a higher perception of unsafety out where there's less people around than in a more urban setting. But also the other thing is that people don't walk as much in regional locations. So they're often, what they're trying to do, it's much less likely that you're able to get them to engage passively with the neighbourhood around them through a great lighting strategy, because they are most likely just heading to their car, because that kind of behaviour is very, very different to what it is in an urban setting where people are often on foot when walking around and moving around in the evenings, much more so.
Great. Well, we've got 5 minutes left. Got a few questions still coming through, but one here that I think is particularly interesting and kind of talks to that some of the stuff you guys have already been talking about is that lighting technology for public spaces. So are there built examples or works in progress that address a reduction in blue light emitted from LEDs, similarly to on a mobile phone, where you can sort of change it from warm to cool in line with circadian rhythms?
Certainly technology out there to do it. It's more relevant a lot of the time in interior architecture. You find this circadian rhythm or this ability to change color temperature to change people's behavioral traits. Like, as someone's saying here, like blue light helps people remembering more details. Like blue light or a saturation of blue light does allow people to concentrate better for a period of time, but you can't be saturating someone with too much blue light for a long period of time because they'll get worn out and unhappy. I think the ability to tune color temperature to suit activity, experience, environment is certainly already there. It's a matter of educating users on when and how to use it, and giving them the tools to control it without being too disruptive. Beck, I mean, your office in Melbourne has got circadian rhythm lighting internally, but externally?
So externally, we've started to look at a couple of projects where it sort of touches on this idea of different modes of activity and using lighting levels to suit those different activities. And color tunable lighting, we have actually started to incorporate into external projects as well. So looking at where you might have the color temperature of the light a little bit warmer, certain dining hours, and then getting actually a little bit cooler to help kind of move people in and around the space so it becomes a bit more of a transition zone, as opposed to having people wanting to sit and stay and congregate in certain areas. Down at Key Quarter, we've actually implemented a system there which does dim and does change throughout different stages of the evening. So from sunrise to sunset, it's quite a warm color temperature at a certain level, and then as the diners start to come in and sit down, it actually drops down a little bit so that the retail spaces and the lighting from the tables and things like that start to take over, and so their background lighting is sort of dropped down a bit, and then as the night kind of progresses on, picking that up again, so that people kind of are moving on and moving through the spaces. But we definitely are starting to see lighting being used a little bit more, I guess, intelligently and thought through into these spaces, which is really exciting. Not just, I think, the architectural lighting in terms of color tuning, but also looking at how you incorporate this dynamic lighting that is a little bit more attuned to the space and responding to the needs and to the actual site-specific locations as well.
There's a very technical question here for you, Rebecca. I don't know if you'll be able to answer it in a few minutes, but you said incorporating textures and reflectances to exterior lighting. Does that mean calculations are being made as full radiosity?
Yeah, so thinking about what the reflectance of materials are, so concrete, has a reflectance value of 0.3, I think, whereas bitumen is a lot lower than that. So yeah, definitely looking at calculations and modelling that incorporates all of the site materials and the build-up of the trees, the build-up of the benches and things like that, so that you're getting a better picture of it. The lighting calculations at the moment for exterior P spaces are just a direct calculation, so they only measure the light falling in a plane. They don't actually incorporate that bounce back of light, which I think we do perceive light like that, and so we should actually start to consider how we incorporate that into our calculations as well.
Great. We have 2 minutes left. I don't know if we'll be able to get through any more questions. It's just been such a great panel and very, very informative. So I would like to thank each of our panelists, Rebecca, Tom, and Jessica. And for everyone out there, this session is being recorded and will be available to watch later. And our next CPD live session is How Timber Sustains Us, presented by Hapwood. But yeah, once again, thank you to our 3 speakers today.
Thank you so much for having me.